Now, there are also a lot of parallels with the two Gracchi brothers, with the two Kennedy brothers, John and Robert Kennedy, where when Robert Kennedy ran to be president in the late 60s, he had already lived through the assassination of his older brother, and it deeply, deeply affected him. Dan Carlin makes this point very, very well, that Bobby Kennedy, before and after Jack had been killed, was a sort of a different man. Afterwards, he was much more radical and also much more cautious, if that makes any kind of sense. He knew what might lie in store for him if he wasn't careful, but actually his worldview and his policies were even more hardline. Well, that's the same for Gaius Gracchus. He was now a much harder line, a much more radical version of his older brother. And the times had changed. You know, from 1963 to 1968, the world had moved on, and politics was even more filled with emotion than it had been. Same goes for Rome. Tensions had heightened, if anything. But the senatorial class had thought they'd sort of put the genie back in the bottle after they'd clubbed Tiberius and a few hundred of his followers to death and thrown them in the Tiber. Because for a few years, things did go back to normal. There weren't any sort of radical demagogue-style tribunes trying to go over the head of the Senate. But as soon as Gaius Gracchus becomes a tribune, which is in a bit, I'll get to his earlier career, but once he becomes a tribune, it's sort of immediately obvious that he's going to start stirring the hornet's nest once more. So, Gaius Gracchus's earlier career. He became a quaestor, which is sort of like there's different types of quaestors, whether they're civic ones or military ones. It seems that he was a military quaestor, which is a type of administrative role, perhaps to do with the balancing of books and things as well. And he was posted to Sardinia. And when you were posted to Sardinia, there was a proconsul, sort of an ex-consul, in charge of Sardinia as a Roman overseas territory. And the proconsul would have, formally, legally, a set of helpers to help him do all the administration, including his quaestors. So Gaius Gracchus is sort of attached to this proconsul. When the proconsul goes to Sardinia, he goes with him. When the proconsul comes back to Rome after his term of office, it's then that his quaestors, Gaius Gracchus and others, can return to Rome with him. This proconsul was called Orestes. So Gaius Gracchus had been in the army 4 years and then achieved the office of quaestor, and he was down in Sardinia for 2 years. And then at the end, when his term was sort of up, or should really have been up, the Senate passed a decree, because they know what's coming. They suspect exactly what and who Gaius Gracchus really is. So they pass a decree keeping the proconsul Orestes in Sardinia for another year. And it's all kind of obviously just a ploy to keep Gaius Gracchus out of politics in Rome. And apparently it's just clear to everybody involved that that's what this is all about. And Gaius Gracchus is sort of, I suppose, old enough and ready to sort of dive into Roman politics, urban Roman politics. So he just sort of defies that decree and returns to Rome. Now, when he gets to Rome, his enemies say immediately try and pull him up on charges for that. You can't just desert your consul, the proconsul, the administrative ruler of Sardinia. You can't just do that. But where Gaius Gracchus was sort of a great lawyer, and we already said already he sort of defended people in court and things, and a superb orator, he knew his mind and he knew how to express it, and he couldn't be messed with very easily. He says, no, it's just by convention that quaestors, after a year, or certainly 2 at most, have to stay with their proconsul. I don't have to, there's no law saying that. And you never passed a law, it was just sort of an order. So no, I haven't broken any law by coming back to Rome. He acquits himself in the law courts. And so his enemies try to pull him up on any other charges, any other sort of trumped up charges they can get. Pun kind of intended, like Trump, just anything they can find to charge against him, no matter how tiny or ridiculous or unjust, they do. So, for example, one of the winters he was in Sardinia, it was extremely cold, and Gaius Gracchus is sent to a nearby kingdom to get sort of a whole bunch of warmer clothes sent over to Sardinia to clothe the legionaries there, so they don't freeze to death in the hills of Sardinia. But apparently this, quote, alarmed the Senate, and they charged that Gaius Gracchus was, quote, attempting to win support of the masses, end quote. One, what's really wrong with that? And two, it's just a trumped-up charge, isn't it? You know, trying to make sure your men don't freeze to death. It's not a crime, is it? Also, while in Sardinia, Gaius Gracchus had tried to, or did, sort of procure more grain for the Romans that were on Sardinia. And apparently the senators, quote, took offence at that in any tiny way, even if it's the right thing to do, in any tiny way, Gaius Gracchus, as a quaestor, that's his sort of thing, administrative and logistics, and, you know, gaining victuals, you know, feeding people, making sure everything works properly, people don't freeze or starve to death. That is sort of the job of a quaestor in all sorts of ways. But if at any tiny moment he'd gone above and beyond what he was sort of formally, legally allowed to do, they tried to bring charges against him. But again, we're told he just acquits himself. And so much so that anyone that heard him speak, who wasn't, you know, his actual political enemy, would be, quote, completely won over to his sympathies. And to top it all off, Gaius Gracchus points out, wherever possible, to anyone that would listen, that he returned from Sardinia without a full purse, i.e. he didn't extort money out of the Sardinian people, which was just de rigueur, it was just par for the course. That's just sort of one of the perks of empire, is that you get to wring money out of people. But he never did, and that nearly everyone else that came back had wine jars, amphora, massive jars meant for holding wine, quote, crammed with gold and silver, and yet he had none, showing, just like his older brother, that he was just, and he took duty seriously, and justice seriously, and he wasn't in the business of extortion. Again, the poor people, the masses of Rome, the urban plebs, loved him for that. So Plutarch says that after all the various accusations and indictments when he comes back from Sardinia, quote, Gaius was able to clear himself completely, and once he had proved his innocence, he immediately began to campaign for election as tribune. All the most distinguished men in Rome, without exception, joined forces to oppose him. But such an immense multitude poured into the city, an immense multitude of normal people, poured into the city from various parts of Italy to support his candidature, that many of them could find no lodgings. So Rome got filled up from all the surrounding countryside. And these aren't people to vote in the assemblies. They're just there to see and hear Gaius Gracchus and lend their voices to cheer him on. Plutarch goes on, and since the Campus Martius, a giant open bit of ground at this point, you know, giant like Central Park or Hyde Park, and since the Campus Martius was too small to hold them, they climbed onto the attics and the rooftops to declare their support for Gaius. So he was sort of from the off, a darling of the people, and of course the senatorial class fear and loathe him. He's very divisive. So in his first attempt to become a tribune of the people, he actually comes fourth in the election, but that's still enough to become one of the 10 tribunes. Plutarch says, quote, he quickly asserted his predominance over the other tribunes, for he was incomparably the finest orator in Rome, and the grief he had suffered encouraged him to speak out fearlessly whenever he lamented the fate of his brother. He seized every occasion to lead the people back to this subject and remind them of what had happened to Tiberius. He also even rebukes some of his older brother's followers from 9-10 years previously. He says things like, look, you basically didn't do enough to save his life. You could have tried harder on that day. He sort of deserted him. And remember that the normal course of events, the law had not been followed. The law was that if Tiberius had been guilty of a crime, that the law courts need to bring up charges, and then he needs to answer and have a trial. You don't just club people to death, certainly not tribunes of the people. You don't just club them to death. And what have you done since? You haven't really brought all the people to account for any of that. You know, if Tiberius had been brought up on charges and then refused to come to the law courts, the procedure is that a trumpeter goes outside his house and trumpets his trumpet. And then if Tiberius doesn't come out, then you're sort of in a position where mobs or violence or force can be used. But none of that happened. None of that procedure was followed. He was just killed on the spot. So among the many things I intend to do during my time as tribune, all sorts of reforms, a lot of Tiberius's reforms, I'm going to continue them on and go further if anything. I'm also going to try and get some sort of at least political revenge on the people that are responsible for it. So again, he doesn't really make a secret of any of this stuff. And so he's just garnering all sorts of enemies, powerful, rich and powerful enemies, who are themselves fairly implacable and certainly ruthless if and when it comes to it. So one of the first things Gaius Gracchus does, and he does just like his older brother, he just does go straight to the people, the assemblies, the popular assembly, just completely ignoring the Senate. And he wants to get Marcus Octavius disqualified. You remember that was the other tribune, who was the nemesis of Tiberius Gracchus and the pawn of the landed senatorial class. He wants to get him disqualified. And another guy, Popilius Laena, who had been heavily involved in the killings and subsequent prosecutions of Tiberius's following, wants to get him disqualified to answer in some way for what they'd done to Tiberius Gracchus and that whole faction. And where I said earlier that Gaius Gracchus was quite an impassioned speaker, not only was it sort of the tone and intonation and substance of what he said, but it was actually even the words he used were sometimes really quite rude. Or Plutarch says, quote, Gaius was never squeamish in his choice of words, quote. So there's one example when someone in the Senate who was openly known to be homosexual was quite rude about Cornelia, Gaius's mother, Gaius and Tiberius's mother. And Gaius apparently shot back by saying, my mother's a saint. You've slept with more men than she has, or you've slept with men more recently than she has, which was apparently very, very rude and scandalous thing to say publicly on the record, as it were. Yeah, so he's got a sharp tongue, old Gaius Gracchus. Okay, so let's talk all about his programme of reform. Now, all the historians, all the secondary historians, people like Will Durant or Mommsen or Holland, they all say that we don't know, because Plutarch doesn't explicitly tell us, we don't know in what order the various sets of reforms that Gaius Gracchus suggests, we don't know in what order they played out. Now, it sort of does matter. You can kind of infer what's likely, but we don't know for sure. So I'll just go through the main ones and leave the most important one till last. So first of all, roads. Rome was very, very famous, isn't it, for being road builders. Well, it's actually only under Gaius Gracchus in the 120s BC where they build loads more roads. And Plutarch specifically says that they're built in a straight line. That's a cliche, isn't it? That all Roman roads are built perfectly in a straight line. Well, they're not. Of course they're not. Anyone that knows anything about it, the ancient Romans didn't literally level mountains and redivert all rivers. They didn't cut tunnels straight through the Alps or anything to make sure all their roads are in a perfectly straight line. Where possible, they'd make them in a straight line, which is just, the most efficient thing to do. But some people have taken that line of Plutarch's, that all Roman roads are built in a straight line, to think that's literally exactly true. Well, of course it's not. But apparently these roads were they are a great example of engineering, and they did really join up big swathes of Italy. And that also generated large amounts of employment, because Rome at this time, as had been for a few generations, sort of filled with the urban poor or homeless, particularly the Aventine Hill. There were lots and lots of extremely poor people, unemployed poor people in Rome. And so if you can put them to work, a bit like Roosevelt's New Deal, if we can just put them to work in any way, that's just better, at least for the short term. And it obviously, doesn't it? It just helps the economy, that people can get things to and from market quicker and easier and more efficiently. So it's just it was a boon for Rome, Gaius Gracchus' road building programme. There are a few reforms in the army. One that was that he made sure that conscription only began at 17. In other words, let's not have child soldiers. That's not a great look, is it? So you have to at least be 17 before you can join the army. The normal people, again, loved that. They didn't necessarily like their children, or like 14-year-olds or whatever, going into the army and getting killed overseas before they can even grab a beard. So that's another thing that the people loved him for. And to just sort of, in most general terms, improve conditions a bit in the army. Again, make sure they've got warm clothes when need be. Make sure they don't starve to death. You would think these bases had already been covered, but no, not necessarily. And at this time already, a lot of the army were poor people. Now, people that know about this might know that in a generation's time, or not even a generation's time, Gaius Marius, brings in many of his reforms, and quite often it's said then, the fairly low resolution view is that it was only then really that he allowed completely unlanded poor people, peasants, into the army. Well, although that's true, that trend had already begun. So again, the poorer people were extremely grateful to Gaius Gracchus for improving their conditions, those of them that were in the legions. He brought in a law to sort of try and alleviate famine and hunger in Rome, the Lex Frumentaria. And this meant that the state itself would buy up massive grain supplies in bulk and keep them in these giant warehouses just outside Rome, or at Ostia, not too far from Rome, and then sell it to the people at a massive discount, for almost nothing. Now, later, in later generations to come, it became completely free. It was a grain dole, and then that became a political tool. But at this point, or before Gaius Gracchus, it hadn't really been done at all. It was up to you to make sure you didn't starve to death, whereas now, the state would help you not die of starvation. And again, building these giant warehouses out at Ostia increased employment. So he made jobs for people and filled their bellies a bit. Of course, he was beloved by the urban masses. He brought in all sorts of reforms. Oh, and by the way, this is over a period of about 2 years. I'm running through all these reforms, but they took a year or two to get through this sort of quite large programme of reform, which changes Rome, fairly profoundly, kind of straight away. And a lot of them have massive echoes down through the centuries. In terms of the provinces, he got laws passed to increase the number of colonies that were being formed by Rome. Even places within Italy that had been under the Roman yoke for centuries already, but not just in Italy. Now, founding a new colony is always expensive, right? So the Senate didn't really like to ever do it, or hardly ever do it. But the people would love it because it meant that you got to leave Rome. You would be sort of funded to leave Rome, where you were probably going to be living in squalor and maybe going hungry still, despite these grain allowances. So you got to go to a new place which wasn't crowded, wasn't dangerous, and you probably wouldn't starve to death. And so it's actually a really appealing thing for the normal people to go and start a new colony somewhere, a new life, a better life somewhere. So once again, it's a measure that the Senate would have hated and the people would have loved. Beyond that, Gaius Gracchus passes laws that says that whoever gets to control these new colonies out in the provinces wouldn't always necessarily be chosen by the Senate. Now, that had always been one of the Senate's prerogatives for a long time, because of course they put themselves in charge of it. They vote one of their own number to be in charge of these things. So they didn't really like having that taken out of their purview, of course. And again, out in not just these new colonies, but in all the provinces of Rome, the Senate had also always been in charge of collecting taxes. Gaius Gracchus tries to, or largely succeeds, in taking that out of their hands as well. Particularly in Asia, what they called Asia, which is really Asia Minor, which is really Turkey, to begin with there, instead of just the senatorial class being in charge of that, and of course skimming off the top and making lots of personal profit out of it. He puts that in the hands of the equites. Now, I've got to say a word here about the equites, or often called the knightly class. So there's not just the super rich, landed, super powerful senatorial class, and then the urban plebs. There's another sort of class of people, I hesitate to call them middle class, because it's not really a middle class as we know it in the modern West. But nonetheless, there's another class of people in Roman society called the equites. Now, so they're not blue-blooded, they're not what Englishmen would used to call the gentry, they're not upper class. Their families aren't necessarily steeped in historical honours. Their family probably wouldn't have boasted many or any consuls or praetors. But nonetheless, they're not peasantry, and they're often rich. The merchant class, you might say, because at that time, or this idea has persisted all through history, that if you're extremely noble, you probably don't get involved in the merchant classes. You own land. That's what noble people do. You own land. You don't buy and sell things. But buying and selling things is a lot more profitable than simply owning land, or can be. So anyway, there's this sort of middle class, in inverted commas, of the equites, who most of them, aren't in the Senate, A lot of them don't even want to be. Why would I want that dangerous and extremely expensive thing of running for office, having to bribe loads of people, and then when you're in the Senate, it's actually a dangerous thing sometimes, and you're open to prosecution unfairly, and it's just a real headache to be in the Senate, unless what you care about above all is becoming a consul. So if you don't care about that, if you want a quieter life, you're happy just to be extremely rich, and still very powerful in all sorts of ways, but not necessarily legally or formally, then you're happy to remain an equite. However, there is tension between the senatorial class and the equites, the knightly order, because as happens, again, all throughout history, is that the moneyed class, sort of the merchant classes, the upper middle classes, become so rich at a certain point that they can't help but sort of infringe on the actual levers of government and power. It's in 1984, isn't it, in Goldstein's book, if anyone's familiar with George Orwell's 1984. He's, in that, Goldstein says, and it's sort of undeniable, isn't it, that all throughout history there are three classes: the top, the middle and the bottom, and the middle and the top swap places sometimes. The bottom strata always stay at the bottom and just exchange rulers at the top, but the middle classes and the upper classes kind of often or sort of endlessly switch around for all sorts of reasons. Well, this is going on, or beginning to go on, in Republican Rome at this point, and Gaius Gracchus sort of lights a fire under it. The extremely rich, because Rome is now sort of a Mediterranean-wide, sort of worldwide, ancient world-wide, spanning empire now. So it's extremely rich. There's so much money flooding into Rome that the middle classes, upper middle classes, knightly orders are becoming fantastically wealthy, and landowners in their own right, often. And so where Gaius Gracchus allows them to start collecting taxes in Asia Minor, they're going to become even richer and even more powerful.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.